Elena, the queen who ruled millions without a throne. Narrator's intro. Book. At the summit of power, one might assume freedom reigns, but the higher the throne, the longer the shadow of loneliness. This is not a tale of royal splendor or political might. It is a tale of two broken hearts, one hidden behind royal armor, the other behind monastic silence. And when those two souls collided not in a ballroom, but in a quiet monastery, they didn't fall in love. They remembered what it meant to be seen. Translated story. At the height of power, one doesn't always feel free. The closer one stands to the throne, the deeper the shadow of isolation stretches. There are hearts thought to have frozen beneath the armor of duty and decorum, yet sometimes, a single glance pure and without motive is enough to crack the strongest walls. This is the story of a crown prince who rejected every noblewoman offered to him because none could touch the human part of him, the part that had been wounded, betrayed, and longed to be seen with sincerity. And this story did not begin in the grand halls of the palace, but in a humble monastery. There, a woman who had once pledged her entire life to the divine would face the hardest question of all. Was love a temptation, or the very path to true awakening? Dawn broke over the stained glass dome of Castle Valeria, where the throne sat at the heart of a majestic great hall. And that same sunlight revealed the chill of a heart long broken. Crown Prince Alejandro, sole heir of King Fernando, had just turned 30 and still refused to marry. Over the past 2 months, 5 noblewomen had been formally introduced with hopes of becoming the future queen. And 5 had left with the same polite, but cold response. "Thank you for your kindness, but my heart cannot welcome anyone at this time." These words, light as a breeze, struck the court like thunder. King Fernando, his hair silvered by the weight of the crown, could no longer hide his disappointment. "My son, you are not just a man. You are the future of this kingdom. You need a queen, a woman to bear heirs of royal blood. More than that, we need a political alliance strong enough to safeguard our land." Alejandro did not respond immediately. He simply walked toward the large window, gazing into the palace garden where he once walked with Lady Isabella, the woman he nearly married, and the first to drive a blade into his heart. 5 years earlier, Isabella of House Altenburgo, a noblewoman with both beauty and intellect, had made Alejandro believe that true love could exist within royal circles. But mere weeks before their engagement, damning evidence surfaced. She had conspired with political enemies to undermine the royal bloodline. "Father," Alejandro finally spoke after a long silence, "I will not repeat that mistake. A political marriage would kill whatever part of me still lives." It wasn't just a reply, it was a vow. Thus, the royal court fell into a frustrating cycle. A princess from the north, a lady from the southern lands, a sea lord's daughter from the east all took their turns, wearing their finest gowns, reciting poetry, and rehearsing smiles before a mirror for hours. And yet all left the palace with the same courteous rejection. "It's like he's searching for a ghost," Queen Catalina sighed one night as she sat with the king in their private chambers. "No one seems to satisfy him." Diplomatic ties began to strain. Rumors flew across the kingdoms. Does the Prince of Valeria think himself a god? Is no one in this world worthy of him? And then one day, the king summoned his son with an unusually stern gaze. "I have been patient. But a king's patience has its limits. You will choose a bride before this year's solstice. If you don't, I will choose for you and you will obey, as both my subject and my son." Alejandro clenched his jaw. 6 months, that was his deadline. 6 months to find a sincere heart, or become a pawn in a game he no longer believed in. That night, standing in the tower beneath a sky of stars, Alejandro whispered into the wind. Is there anyone out there who can see me? Not as the crown prince of Valeria, but as a man with a broken heart, still longing to be loved. He didn't know that just 2 miles away, a woman knelt in prayer beneath a flickering candle in a secluded monastery. A nun with emerald eyes. A buried past. And a destiny quietly awakening. Santa Clara Monastery sat peacefully atop a sloping hill, where the air was sweet with wild herbs and sun-dried incense. For over 5 centuries, its stone walls had borne witness to prayer, fasting, and quiet renunciation. Here, there were no crowns, no music of feasts, only the hourly chime of the bell, and bare feet crossing cold stone at dawn. On an early autumn morning, as sunlight kissed the leaves, a young woman bent over a patch of chamomile. Her fingers were slender, strong. Her robe was plain, but her figure carried grace. And her eyes, those eyes blue like misty pine forests, holding a sorrow so soft it burned, and a fire no vow could extinguish. She had once been Elena de Montero, daughter of a noble northern house, a name once spoken in royal halls and courtly dances. But after her family was falsely accused, their estate seized, and her mother died in grief, she vanished from the world. For 5 years, only the monastery knew she was still alive. Now, she was Sister Elena, a humble nun who lived by prayer, nurtured herbs, sang in the choir, and whispered each night, "Let me forget who I once was, and all that I once claimed." But destiny, in its strange karmic rhythm, brought Alejandro heir to the throne, to the very place where she had hidden herself. On St. Mateo's Day, the king and crown prince visited Santa Clara for the inauguration of a chapel funded by the royal treasury. It was a grand event. All nuns were required to prepare. Elena's voice, among them, had been chosen to lead the choir. As the royal procession entered the monastery's courtyard, every nun lowered her gaze, refusing to look directly at those who lived outside the sacred vows. And then, like a line written in an ancient scripture, Alejandro looked up, and his eyes met hers. A moment. The world paused. No sound. No breeze. Even the sun seemed to hold its breath. Those blue eyes, neither flirtatious nor rehearsed, were simply present, as if his soul was being reflected from a world where no masks were needed. Elena looked up too. And for the first time in 5 years, her heart pounded wildly, not for a future king, but for someone who saw her, not as a nun, not as a fallen lady, but simply as a human being. She did not know his name. He did not know hers. But fate does not need introductions to knock. The ceremony began. Elena's voice rose above the others, clear as morning dew. Each note, soft as prayer, seemed to come from somewhere divine. But her heart was restless, not from temptation, as scripture might say, but because for the first time, she could not separate her soul from the gaze that followed her. After the service, guests were invited to a light meal in the courtyard. Some nuns were asked to serve Elena among them. As she poured wine for Alejandro, their hands brushed. "Forgive me, Your Highness," she whispered. "No need to apologize, sister," Alejandro replied, his voice gentler than the breeze. "Your voice was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years." "It was merely an offering to God," she said, steadying her heart. "And the one who carried that offering, who is she?" "Sister Elena Altea." "Elena," he repeated, as if naming a star for the first time in his own sky. In that moment, perhaps both of them knew. Something had begun. Something forbidden. But utterly unavoidable. That night, Alejandro could not sleep. The man who thought his heart was sealed shut, smiled at the memory of still, blue eyes. And Elena, by candlelight in her narrow room, tried to pray. But when she closed her eyes, she saw not the cross but a pair of eyes, quietly broken, just like hers. That night, in her private chamber, Elena knelt before the statue of the saint, tears silently streaming down her cheeks. "Dear Lord, or whoever is truly listening, I renounce the world. Why would you place this trial in my heart now?" She clutched her rosary tightly. The cold, rounded beads reminded her of those fleeting brushes of skin between her hand and Alejandro's. If only the heart could be shut as tightly as a monastery door, how much simpler life would be. On a foggy morning, with mist still blanketing the monastery steps, Elena was summoned to the private chamber of Mother Abbess Beatrice. But today, the elderly nun's eyes weren't soft. They narrowed sharp like a blade worn thin by years of slicing between truth and deception. "Elena, you know I've cherished you like my own daughter," she began, her voice trembling, but resolute. "But what I must say now, can no longer be kept secret." Elena sat down, a chill crawling up her spine not from the weather, but from the gnawing sense that something long buried was about to be unearthed. The Crown Prince's repeated visits have caused a stir not just here, but outside our walls. And worse still, I've received a letter. She handed Elena a scroll sealed in red wax. A letter from the Duke of Orboli. Elena froze, her face turning pale. That name was the nightmare she thought she'd buried. He's still alive, she whispered. "Not only alive," said Mother Beatrice, "but more powerful than ever. He's discovered that you're Elena de Montero. And he's demanding the reinstatement of the marriage pact that once bound you to his son." Elena stood abruptly, her chair crashing to the floor. "No. I can't go back to that darkness. I fled that arranged marriage, fled those bloodied hands that destroyed my family." Mother Beatrice's gaze softened with sorrow. "I know. But he's a duke. A powerful man. And if the prince continues to visit you, he'll use it to defame not just you, but the crown and the church." That evening, Alejandro stood on the palace tower, his eyes fixed on the monastery, where a faint candle flickered like a silent prayer. The wind was sharp, but his heart burned not with desire, but with a fierce yearning to protect something fragile and sacred, truth. He had endured long enough. If this feeling was just a fleeting emotion, he could have walked away. But no, those eyes, that voice, those quiet words from Elena, they pulled him back to the part of himself he'd lost in the machinery of the crown. By morning, he summoned Don Rodrigo de Mendoza, the most loyal advisor to the royal family, and once a dear friend to Count Altamirano, Elena's father. "I want to reopen the investigation," Alejandro said. "The case against Elena de Montero. The charge of treason. Something is off. Deeply off." Don Rodrigo didn't ask why. He understood this wasn't just about a nun. This was about uncovering the rot that had once festered deep within the royal court. Weeks later, in the royal secret library, Don Rodrigo presented a faded scroll. His voice was calm, but weighty. "Your Highness, what I've found is shocking. Eleonora was the only child of Count Altamirano. After her father's suspicious death, the entire family estate was seized under charges of treason, charges that were never backed by solid evidence. The confiscation order wasn't signed by the ailing king, but by Duke Orboli, who acted as regent during His Majesty's illness." Alejandro clenched his fists. "And the arranged marriage?" "Exactly. Less than a week later, Orboli offered to marry Eleonora to his son as a mercy, to preserve some honor for her family. That wasn't mercy. That was conquest," Alejandro said coldly. Indeed. The night before the wedding, Eleonora disappeared. A maid testified that she fled after discovering a forged document implicating Orbeli in her father's demise. Alejandro tightened his grip on the scroll, his gaze icy and resolute. I will make this truth public. But first, I must speak to Elena. That afternoon, in the quiet herb garden, Elena was picking mint leaves when she heard the familiar footsteps. Your Highness, she said softly. Elena, he replied. He didn't call her sister anymore. No pretense. No veil of formality. I know everything. About your family. The wedding you fled. The man who stole your life. Elena backed away, her eyes filling with tears. I can't go back to who I was. I made a vow. You made that vow, in despair. In grief. You chose the monastery because it was the only place left to survive, didn't you? She said nothing. Then slowly nodded. I'm not asking you to abandon your faith, Alejandro continued. I just want you to know, to me, you're not a nun. You're not a noble woman. You're the first person who ever looked at me and didn't see a crown. Elena's tears fell. Her heart was being pulled in two directions, the buried pain of her past, and a new hope rising one she thought she'd buried forever beneath her habit. Santa Clara Monastery fell into an eerie stillness. After each visit from the prince, the air grew heavier like a storm had passed in silence. The nuns became quieter, more guarded. Whispers swirled in corners like weeds left unplucked. Something was coming. Elena could feel it, like a blind woman sensing footsteps. Then the bell rang late afternoon. Not a bell for prayer. A bell for emergency summons. Elena, sit down, said Mother Beatrice. Her voice was no longer maternal, but cold, like a guardian at the gate of heaven. I've just received word from the Archdiocese of Valeria. The rumors about you and the prince have reached the Archbishop. Elena's heart pounded. Her eyes betrayed what her lips could not deny. They're asking you to leave the monastery. What? She choked. They're banishing me. No, Beatrice replied slowly. They're giving you two choices. One, transfer to the Sagrada Monastery in the remote northern mountains, where no one can reach you. 2, face a public trial, be examined for breaking your vows, and risk excommunication. Elena was stunned. It wasn't the punishment that broke her, it was the fear of losing the only refuge she thought she had chosen out of faith. That night, she knelt at the altar in the small chapel. No one saw her tears. But they fell silent, steady from eyes that had withstood so much. Dear Lord, if this is a test, please show me the way. Is this feeling temptation? Or is it a divine challenge to awaken compassion within me? If you created love, then why would you let my heart burn for someone I cannot have? But the more she prayed, the clearer Alejandro's image became, not as a prince, but as a man standing alone, against a world that once tried to break him, just as it had broken her. The next morning, Elena was watering herbs when suddenly Alejandro appeared. No ceremony. No escorts. No official reason. Sister Elena, he called, not with reverence, but with fear and desperation. They're taking you away. To the northern monastery. They want to isolate you from me, from everything. Please leave, she whispered. If you come again, everything will collapse. Alejandro stepped closer, his eyes moist. Then let me say this and go. From his coat, he pulled a letter. A letter he had written in a sleepless night. Elena, I don't know whose side heaven is on. But if God truly understands the human heart, then he must understand that mine beats for you. I won't ask you to break your vow. I only ask that you don't break your own heart. If I must give up the throne, if I must live as a common man, then so be it. If it means I can live by your side. Elena read it, her hands trembling. She didn't answer. She simply pressed the letter to her chest, as if trying to hear each word echo in her soul. But the church is not a place where hearts get to decide. 2 days later, the monastery guards arrived. They came with official orders for Elena's transfer. That morning, in the monastery courtyard, she was quietly sharing breakfast porridge with the other nuns. When her name was called, she stood not afraid, not in tears. I understand, she said calmly. Her voice was soft as water, though her eyes were dulled like cooled ash. Mother Beatrice embraced her, eyes brimming. My daughter, there are things the law will never understand. And there are loves that need no defense. Elena gripped her hands. Thank you, Mother. I only lived again because someone saw me in the dark. No one knew that hidden behind the boxwood trees, cloaked in black, stood a man watching in silence. Alejandro had arrived at dawn. And he had waited through the wind, through the rain, just to say goodbye to her without a single touch. But the moment he saw her step into the carriage, rain sliding gently down her hair, something inside him snapped like a bowstring pulled too tight. This cannot be how it ends, he whispered. And he ran from the shadows. Elena. The cry made everyone turn. 2 monks stepped between him and the carriage. Your Highness, please step back. But Elena had already leapt down from the carriage. Alejandro, why did you come? Because I can't let you leave like a criminal. He approached, ignoring the judgment in the monk's eyes. You've done nothing wrong. If there's any sin here, it's that this world has turned love into something forbidden. Elena couldn't speak. She simply looked at him, rain in her eyes and light. They say, true love knows how to let go, she whispered. But why does my heart want to stay? Alejandro took her hand, the same hand he once only brushed during a formal wine pour. This time, there was nothing left to hide. Elena, I'm not asking you to break your vow. I only ask for one thing. What is it? One kiss. She froze. The rain kept falling. Time stood still. And then amid priests, amid holy orders, amid the dividing lines of right and wrong, Elena stepped forward and touched Alejandro's face. One kiss. Soft. So soft. But it carried 5 years of silence, a lifetime of sorrow, and all the words neither dared to speak. When they parted, both were crying. I will go, Elena whispered. Because I cannot yet break a vow that has not been lifted. But I will wait. If there is a path for us, I will walk it. Even if it means snow, mountains, or a lifetime in the dark. Alejandro nodded. And I will find that path. Even if I must give up my throne to do it. The next morning in the palace, King Fernando slammed his fist on the council table. He kissed a nun. In front of the clergy. Sire, said Don Rodrigo calmly, what if she's not truly a nun? What if her vow was made under duress and grief? If canon law has even the smallest window, then perhaps, there is still a way. You're talking about vow annulment, the king narrowed his eyes. Yes. Canon law clearly states, if a person takes religious vows solely to escape a forced marriage or mortal danger, that vow may be annulled if proven and submitted to the Holy See. Fernando was silent. And Orboli. We have evidence he fabricated charges to seize the Altamirano estate, Don Rodrigo said, pulling a sealed report. If presented before the royal court, he will lose everything. The king exhaled bitterly. A love that dares to unravel both politics and canon law. Then his gaze drifted toward the horizon, and for the first time, there was no anger in his eyes, only memory. Perhaps, he's loved the right person after all. 1 week after Elena was sent to the Sagrada Monastery in the northern mountains, Crown Prince Alejandro no longer appeared at royal meetings. The palace buzzed with rumors. Some said he had been punished. Others whispered that he'd gone mad for love. But few knew that behind the locked door of a quiet western chamber, the light stayed on every night where Alejandro and Don Rodrigo were quietly unraveling an entire dark chapter of the kingdom's past. The people don't know, Alejandro said, his voice low and steady, but history must be rewritten. Not by the victor's pen but by the truth. Don Rodrigo laid a thick folder on the mahogany table. These are the testimonies from the former steward of House Altamirano. He once overheard Duke Orboli plotting with the royal judge about fabricating treason charges to seize the estate. Alejandro nodded, flipping through another document. And here's the list of properties that changed hands within 3 months of the count's death. Every one ended up under Orboli's control. He didn't just want the land, Don Rodrigo said quietly. He wanted Eleonora. And when he couldn't force her into marriage, Alejandro clenched his fists. He sentenced her to a life in the cloister as if that were mercy. Alejandro couldn't file the charges directly under watchful eyes of the church. But there was a way, the Royal Council of Justice, whose members were bound by oath to rule without bias, no matter who stood accused. But for the case to proceed, they needed more than ink. They needed living proof. They needed someone brave enough to stand before power. Alejandro turned to Don Rodrigo. Will you go? All my life I've served the crown, the old man said. But starting today, I choose to serve justice. Meanwhile, at the cold and remote Sagrada Monastery, nestled among cliffs and pine forests, Elena lived a life that felt more like exile. Each day, she gardened, embroidered altar cloths, and prayed in silence. But within her heart, no psalm echoed louder than the memory of one man who promised to find her, even through storm and shadow. The Mother Superior, a strict but perceptive woman, was wary at first. But after a week of watching Elena in silence, she stepped into her room one evening. You have a spirit that cannot be caged, she said gently. I've seen it in your eyes. And I've heard it in your song, even when you didn't sing. Elena bowed her head. I don't sing anymore. But your heart still does, the abbess replied. They sent you here by order. But I have a feeling, you're here waiting for someone. Elena looked up, and for the first time in days, there was a glimmer in her eyes. Yes. But not just for love, she said. For justice. For my father. For the name that was dragged through the mud. Back in Valeria, political tension rose like a tide when Duke Orboli heard of Alejandro's investigation. He stormed into the palace, demanding that the king put an end to this ridiculous romance. But this time, King Fernando did not yield. I've read the documents, the king said firmly. If these accusations are proven, you will no longer be a duke, Orboli. Orboli sneered. You believe a nun could shake the throne? That your son can stand against the church? The king responded slowly, I believe, you've grown too used to manipulating truth. But this time, you're up against a heart that needs no crown to speak it. Don Rodrigo stood before the Royal Council of Justice, hands slightly trembling, but eyes ablaze. Your Honors, I present original documents, sworn testimonies from servants of Count Altamirano, and property records from before and after the so-called treason seizure. The Chief Justice raised an eyebrow. You claim this was a conspiracy. Not just a conspiracy, Don Rodrigo replied. But treason in disguise. Gasps filled the chamber. And the one person who can testify to it all, is being held in a mountain monastery. Not because she sinned, but because she carries the truth of a dark age. At that very moment, Alejandro rode through a snowstorm, crossing treacherous paths to reach Sagrada. Beneath his cloak, he carried a petition verified by canon law scholars seeking annulment of a coerced vow, complete with signatures, seals, and most importantly, the truth. He whispered into the wind. Elena, wait for me. Not just with love, but for the justice you were never given. The Sagrada Monastery sat atop a cliff shrouded in cloud, a place where fog felt like a forgotten dream. Its tall gray gates remained sealed like lips keeping sacred secrets. Here, every nun lived as if she had already died to the world. But on that morning, at a place where hope dared not tread, a knock echoed 3 times. Firm. Unwavering. A nun opened the door, and froze. A man stood soaked with morning dew, a white horse behind him, and a royal scroll in hand. I am Alejandro de Valeria, Crown Prince of the realm. I seek audience with the Mother Superior, and with Sor Elena Altia. In the monastery's receiving room, where dim light filtered through narrow windows, the Mother Superior sat across from Alejandro. Her eyes, which had seen hundreds forsake the world, could not conceal the doubt in them, gazing at the man who now stood before the church, for a nun. Your Highness, she said sternly, your presence here is improper. This monastery is no refuge for worldly hearts. Alejandro did not protest. He bowed in respect, and laid a velvet-wrapped scroll on the table. I have not come to steal Sor Elena from her faith. I have come to return her right to choose. The Mother Superior slowly unwrapped the scroll. It was a formal petition for vow annulment backed by investigation records proving that Elena de Montero had entered the convent not of devotion, but of desperation, fleeing a forced marriage imposed by the man who destroyed her family. Alejandro's voice rang clear. If the Church truly stands for mercy and truth, then it cannot bind someone with a vow made in sorrow. Elena was led to the private chamber. A room divided by iron bars, separating the sacred from the secular. When she stepped inside and saw Alejandro waiting, her breath caught in her throat. Alejandro. Elena, he replied, rising to his feet, his hands clenched but his eyes gentle. I didn't come here to make you abandon your faith. I came to give you back your freedom. He slid a folder through the bars. This is the annulment request, legally validated, with the seal of both the Canonical Council and Vatican scholars. If you choose, you may sign it. Elena took it with trembling hands. All the years inside the convent, the long nights of prayer, the countless times she forced herself to believe happiness was a path forbidden to her, it all rose like a tidal wave. And now, the question was laid bare. Do you want to live as yourself again? I won't pressure you, Alejandro whispered. If you refuse, I'll honor that. But I will love you until the end of my days, whether I see you from behind these bars, or beside me. Elena looked into his eyes. What she saw was not a prince but a man, loving her with honesty, tenderness, and shared pain. She smiled. I don't need iron bars to know where I belong. Then, She picked up the pen and signed. The ink spilled onto the paper like a bell tolling, breaking invisible chains. The Mother Superior entered. She looked at the document, then at Elena. "You've made your choice." "Yes, Mother. Not to abandon my faith, but to live it, with a heart that is free." Her gaze, once stern, now softened into sorrow, like a mother giving away her daughter at the altar. "Then go, my child, and hold fast to the holiest vow of all, to love." That afternoon, beneath golden sunlight spilling over the mountaintop, Alejandro and Elena left Sagrada Monastery. No guards. No royal procession. Only two souls, once broken, once abandoned, once silent, now walking together toward the light. "We've lost something on this road," Elena whispered. "But we've found everything," Alejandro replied. "You're no longer a nun. And I may no longer be king. But if we have each other, then titles mean nothing." 10 days later, inside the marble grand hall of Valeria Palace. A hall that had seen coronations, royal banquets, and sacred oaths, a historic announcement was about to be made. Every noble, bishop, magistrate, and counselor in the kingdom was present. Whispered rumors flared like wildfire. The tale of the crown prince bringing a defrocked nun into the palace had ignited scandal across the land. They called it blasphemy, treason, madness in love. But Alejandro did not flinch. He entered the hall in a silver-gray ceremonial robe the color of humility. No crown. No golden embroidery. Beside him walked Elena, dressed simply in white, no diamonds, no veil. But her emerald eyes still carried the sacred flame that had once shattered a prince's walls. King Fernando sat atop his throne, heavy with judgment. Beside him stood the Archbishop of Valeria, the enforcer of canonical law. In the shadows loomed Duke Orbeli, pale and bitter, his eyes burning with fury and pride. Alejandro stopped at the center of the hall. His voice rang out, calm and clear. "Your Majesty, my lords, I am not here to ask for permission. I am here to present the truth, and to keep a promise." He turned toward his father, pausing a few seconds, hoping for a glance of support. But the king neither nodded nor shook his head. He simply watched. Alejandro continued. "The woman beside me, once known as Sor Elena Altia, is in truth Elena de Montero, daughter of the late Count Altamirano, who was wrongfully accused of treason during the regency." Gasps erupted through the room. "I have investigated," Alejandro declared. "There is evidence that Duke Orbeli, while acting as regent, fabricated those charges to seize the Montero estate, then attempted to cover his tracks by forcing Eleonora into a political marriage." The Archbishop's voice rang out, sharp and accusatory. "But she is a nun. She made sacred vows. No love can overrule a promise made to God." Alejandro turned toward him, composed. "Your Grace, according to Canon Law 118, Clause 3, a vow made under coercion, threat, or without full consent is not eternally binding and may be annulled by ecclesiastical authority. I carry here the approved petition, reviewed and signed by canon law scholars from Rome." Don Rodrigo stepped forward, presenting the original decree sealed and signed by the cardinal in charge of Vatican legal doctrine. A thunderous blow to the Archbishop's authority. The hall fell silent. And Alejandro spoke again. "I do not speak only with documents. I speak with my heart." He turned to Elena, took her hand. "She is not a challenge to the Church. She is the embodiment of its teachings, where truth must shine, and love must never be born from lies." Elena lifted her chin. Her eyes met the hundreds staring at her. Then she spoke, her voice quiet, but enough to still the room. I do not ask for a crown. I do not seek pity. I ask only this: to live under my true name. To no longer be called a runaway, or a traitor nun. I am Elena de Montero, daughter of a man falsely condemned. And I love a man not for his power, but for the truth I see in his soul. At that, Duke Orbeli leapt up, snarling. This is a political farce. A coup. A treasonous play. Alejandro turned to him. No, Your Grace. This is the end of a lie that has lasted half a decade. Don Rodrigo stepped forward with the final blow. A dossier filled with evidence of illegal land transfers, falsified testimonies, and maps confirming that Montero properties had been stolen. Signed by 3 living witnesses, 2 of whom were once Orbeli's own trusted men. The king stood in heavy silence. Then, at last, he spoke. Duke Orbeli. By royal authority, I hereby strip you of all titles, positions, and property. Your case shall be handed to the Council of Justice for criminal trial. Orbeli paled. Even his former allies avoided his gaze. Then, in the charged silence, King Fernando turned to his son. My son, you forced this court to listen to a heart again. And perhaps, that is what I as a father never truly did for you. A radiant spring unlike any in Valeria's memory swept through the kingdom. Cherry trees in the palace gardens bloomed, early petals soft as silk, pink as a bride's first smile. The kingdom celebrated. Flags were raised. Banners embroidered with the phrase, "Love is greater than the throne." Not because they worshipped royalty, but because in this love story, they saw something human. Something true. The wedding of Crown Prince Alejandro and Eleonora de Montero was set for early April, 1 year to the day since their eyes first met on the feast of Saint Mateo. But this wedding was unlike any royal marriage before it. No gold. No parades. No lavish procession. Alejandro wrote each invitation by hand. Elena chose an ivory dress, unadorned, no jewels, no veil. Only a small crown of white daisies, flowers she once grew in the Santa Clara herb garden. That morning, inside the royal chapel, silence fell as the oak doors creaked open. Elena walked in. Not dazzling like a duchess, but breathtaking like a quiet star emerging from centuries of stillness. Her beauty was not of adornment, but of having survived. Queen Catalina, Alejandro's mother, wept at the first sight of her. That girl, she whispered to her husband, isn't a princess. She is a living lesson. King Fernando said nothing. He simply held his wife's hand. That day, he did not sit on the throne. He chose a seat below it as a father, not a king. Alejandro stood at the altar. His eyes never left Elena. As she reached his side, wind swept through her copper-brown hair. He leaned in, and whispered. I once believed the crown was my destiny. But you are my destiny. Elena said nothing in return. She simply took his hand. The hand that had defied law, power, and even fate itself for her. The archbishop, once their fiercest opponent, now presided over their vows. He had reviewed the legal annulment months earlier, confirmed by the Vatican. Elena's vow had never been valid, as it had not been freely given. And today, he stood not before a prince and a nun, but before 2 souls, finally free. Souls that had dared to love, dared to suffer, and dared to prove. Truth does not reside in words, but in how one lives with a true heart. When Alejandro recited his vow, his voice did not waver. I, Alejandro, do not marry you only out of love. but out of deep admiration for your courage, your unshakable spirit, and your heart that knows how to forgive. If you are a jewel, then not a polished pearl, but a stone hidden in the earth, uncrushed, undaunted. Elena's voice cracked as she replied, I, Eleonora, marry you not to become queen, but to be your partner, your friend, and the one who reminds you that no crown is higher than the human heart. And if ever this palace crumbles, I will still be beside you, replanting a garden of flowers. As the rings were exchanged, the church bells rang long and clear, like a hymn washing away years of sorrow, like a signal of a new era, one where justice was no longer hidden behind crests, and love no longer had to wear the veil of a vow. They kissed for the first time, in front of the entire kingdom. No one protested, no one whispered, because everyone knew they were witnessing a wedding of truth. That evening, there was no hard liquor, no extravagant dancing, only soft music and poetry, the kind Elena and Alejandro once recited to each other in an herb garden long ago. Mother Beatriz, granted special leave from Santa Clara to attend the wedding, sat quietly at the edge of the banquet hall, smiling a rare, gentle smile. She whispered, almost to herself, faith is not a barrier to love, if that love makes the soul more holy. After the royal wedding, Valeria was no longer just a kingdom of old laws and rigid ranks. The people began calling Elena by a new name, the Queen of Compassion. Though she had never officially been crowned, in their hearts, she had surpassed every measure of a queen. Not long after the wedding, Elena stunned the entire royal court with a bold move. She reopened a shelter for the homeless in the old quarter, the very neighborhood that had once been demolished under Duke Orbeli's reign to build opulent government buildings. A palace cannot stand in glory, she said at a council meeting, while beneath its walls, mothers burn dry grass to keep their children warm. Many thought it was just the sentimental idealism of a woman with a tragic past. But then they saw her, with former nuns from Santa Clara, bandaging wounds of street children, distributing hot soup on freezing nights, sewing blankets with her own hands for the elderly. One evening, Alejandro found her seated in a dusty storeroom, hands grimy, hair tousled. He didn't scold her. He knelt beside her, took her hand, and said softly, I loved you when you were a nun. But now, I revere you as my queen. From compassion, Elena moved toward education. She proposed the founding of a school for abandoned girls, something unprecedented in Valeria, where peasant daughters were only taught to cook and stay silent. They must learn, she said at the opening ceremony, so they do not repeat the tragedy I once lived. Only when the mind is lit, can one choose between submission and freedom? Strangely enough, noble families soon began sending their daughters to study alongside the orphans. Not out of obligation, but out of admiration. Alejandro, still crown prince, let her lead like a lantern in the dark. At a royal oath ceremony, he declared, I may have been born into a crown, but it was a woman from behind monastery walls who taught me how to be worthy of it. Under Elena's influence, land laws were reformed. Families once robbed by political schemes were restored. Servants of the Altamirano household, Elena's old kin, were invited back to the palace, not as subordinates, but as family. Yet Elena lived simply, as she always had. She refused a personal maid. She still rose early to chant and walk mindfully through the gardens. At times, She even snuck into the kitchen to help light the stoves. The handmaidens whispered, "No queen has ever made cold remedy soup for the palace guards. No noblewoman has ever knit wool sweaters for peasant children." But Elena didn't need to be understood. She knew, action is the noblest answer to prejudice. 1 year after the wedding, Elena gave birth to a baby boy. With emerald eyes like hers. And a crooked half-smile like Alejandro's. The royal family celebrated. But it was the people who rejoiced. That heir, they said, was born not just of royal blood, but of true love. Alejandro named him Mateo, to honor the feast day when he first saw her. A nun among voices of angels. But Elena whispered, "Add one more name. Ananda." In Sanskrit, it means transcendent joy. Because this child is not only a prince, but proof that love can break through all rules, and become a path to awakening. One rare sunset, the two of them sat atop the tower, gazing into the distance, where the misty outline of Santa Clara Monastery could still be seen. "Elena," Alejandro asked softly, "if you hadn't looked at me that day, would you have stayed in the convent forever?" She replied without hesitation, "Perhaps. But my soul would have withered. You can run from the world, but never from your own heart." He tightened his grip on her hand, then whispered, "And had I never found you, I would have been a lonely king, with power, but no one to remind me that compassion is the true crown." 3 years after the royal wedding, Valeria bloomed like never before. Southern wheat fields flourished. Schools rose even in the most remote villages. Monasteries began teaching orphans not only scripture, but also literacy and self-love. It seemed all storms had passed. But darkness always waits at the edges of light. One October morning, while Elena was reviewing plans for mobile health clinics for the poor, Don Rodrigo, now Alejandro's chief advisor, hurried into her study. "Your Grace, I fear there is trouble." Elena looked up calmly. "Speak freely." "Cardinal Nicholas of the Northern Diocese has issued a decree, refusing to recognize your marriage to the Crown Prince." She frowned. "Why? The Church already ruled my vows null and void." Don Rodrigo exhaled. "Because a former confessor at Santa Clara has sent a letter to the Central Council, claiming that your internal consent when taking your vow was valid. That it should never have been annulled." Elena fell silent. Then asked, "Was it Father Benedict?" Rodrigo nodded. She closed her eyes. Father Benedict had once told her to live in penance to redeem her family's karma. A rigid man, deeply biased against the nobility. And someone who had never accepted that a defector nun could become the matriarch of a kingdom. Alejandro immediately convened a legal summit with the Royal Council and a Vatican delegate. But this time, the battle wasn't about paper. It was about belief versus control. Some in the church began to waver. They didn't oppose Elena for legal reasons, but because her existence was dangerous. If Elena, a nun who had renounced her vow, could become a queen and reformer, what would stop other nuns from asking questions too? From challenging traditions? From choosing a different path? Elena became more than a woman. She became a living question. A quiet revolution. A hearing was held. And Elena uncoerced requested to testify herself. In the ancient hall, once used to try rebellions, she stepped onto the wooden platform, surrounded by eyes full of judgment and curiosity. She wore no crown, no royal gown, only a plain indigo robe, the same kind she once wore the day she entered the convent. Her voice rose slow and serene. I am not here to defend my title. I am here to testify to one truth: that a person can change when they finally understand their own heart. When I entered the convent, I didn't know what I was fleeing. I thought it was for faith. But now I know it was fear. Fear of being sold into political marriage. Fear of my past crushing me. Fear that silence was safer than struggle. She paused, her gaze sweeping the council. But when I met that man Alejandro, he didn't see me as a woman with a painful past. He saw me as someone alive. And that woke me up. I did not abandon God. I simply chose to love Him in a different way. A way that has compassion, action, and freedom. The entire chamber fell silent. Then unexpectedly the High Cardinal of Rome, an elderly man nearing 80, slowly stood. He walked toward Elena and gazed deeply into her eyes. Not the eyes of a naive girl, but those of a woman who had walked through fire, and still carried compassion. He bowed his head. My child, no one can take away faith from someone who lives it truthfully. Then he turned to the council. I declare, the convent vow was lawfully annulled. The marriage between Elena and the crown prince is fully valid, both in canon and divine law. When Elena exited the chamber, the entire royal court stood. No decree, no command. Yet all bowed. Even those who had once opposed her most fiercely. Alejandro waited at the base of the steps, silent. He simply took her hand, and held it tightly. You never needed me to save you, he whispered. Elena smiled gently. Because I was never weak. I only ever needed someone to walk beside me. Not ahead to pull, nor behind to push. From that day on, the name Elena de Montero was no longer shadowed by doubt. It became a symbol, not just of love that transcended church law, but of a reign born from compassion, and lit by the wisdom of the heart. Valeria entered a new era, not with trumpet calls or royal edicts, but through quiet, lasting changes. Every school built in a distant village, every free clinic near a bustling market, every book given to an orphan, carried Elena's imprint. The people didn't call her Queen of Power. They called her Mother of Valeria. Alejandro still ruled. But he was no longer the guarded prince who once rejected every noble bride. He became a king who bowed to wisdom, who listened to the people, and who stepped back when truth needed to be spoken with a woman's voice. At a noble council, when a lord protested a new academy to train female nurses, Elena didn't raise her voice. She simply asked, "Do you have a daughter, sir?" "Yes," he replied. "And if one day your daughter falls ill, and no woman is trained to help her, will you regret being here today?" There was no answer. The decree was signed that night. Something unprecedented followed. Elena proposed a women's assembly of the central provinces, inviting farmers, weavers, clergy, even illiterate widows, into the palace to share their hardships. Many thought it was symbolic. But soon, their humble proposals: lower the salt tax, let widowed women keep their land, build shelters for domestic abuse victims, became national policy. And people began to say, King Alejandro rules with strength, but Queen Elena rules with the heart. Yet Elena's daily life barely changed. She refused royal escorts when visiting children's homes. She still brought her basket to the market, asked for vegetable prices herself. She often visited the royal prison. Not to judge, but to listen. A guard once said. She sat beside a woman who cried for an hour. No sermons. No advice. Just silence so the woman could speak. Elena once explained. Some wounds only need one thing. A listener. When Prince Matteo turned 3, Elena didn't let him grow up wrapped in silk. She took him to villages. Let him feel dust on his skin. Smell wild grass. And play with common children. One day, Matteo scraped his hand climbing a tree. A servant panicked. Your Majesty. The air cannot be allowed to get dirty like this. Elena just smiled. If my child doesn't understand the pain of a scratch, how will he ever understand the pain of a people living through winter with empty bowls? In those years, neighboring nations visited Valeria not just for treaties, but to witness a kingdom governed not by military force, but by morality and trust. President Arland of the Eastern Kingdom once said before departing, I do not fear Valeria's power. I envy the compassion they've turned into policy. But Elena was never proud. One quiet night, with just the two of them in the chapel, she told Alejandro, I haven't done anything grand. I just never forgot that I was once a child who lost everything. And I believe God didn't mean for me to stay silent forever. Alejandro held her hand and whispered, because you never forgot. Valeria will never forget you. 10 years after their wedding, Valeria entered its most stable period in history. Neighboring nations called it the heart of the West. Scholars came not to document wars, but to study how kindness could reshape a nation. Yet in the most beautiful of days, a breeze always stirs, like a whisper of impermanence. In June of that year, after visiting the Northern Highlands, where orphaned children welcomed her with rough-woven scarves, Elena returned pale. She said she was only tired. But Alejandro knew. A woman who had endured so much would never say tired unless something was eating away at her. The royal physician, after many visits, finally spoke the truth. Your Highness, the Queen suffers from a genetic blood disorder. Slow progressing, but incurable. Alejandro was silent, just as he had been the day he first learned that the woman he loved once lived in a convent he couldn't enter. But this time, he didn't fight fate. He simply sat beside her more often. They didn't need words. Their trembling fingers spoke for their hearts. One night, Elena looked through a stained glass window. Stars reflected in her eyes, like a dream preparing to leave the earth. What do you fear most? Alejandro asked softly. Not death, she said. I fear that what I planted will one day be mistaken as the miracle of a single person, when all I ever did was open a door. The ones who come next, they're the ones who must keep the light. A few months later, Elena announced her decision to leave the palace. No one understood. The royal council was stunned. The people wept. They feared she was being forced out. Or worse, that a conspiracy was unfolding. But at the official declaration, Elena wore the same plain gray dress from years ago, and stood in the packed city square. She said, every reign needs a symbol, but a kingdom should never depend on one person. If light only shines when I'm present, then that light is false. I've sown the seeds. Now, it's time for you to tend the soil with your own hands. She left everything. The throne, the crown, the estate. She took only 3 things. An old prayer book, Alejandro's poetry, and a wooden necklace he once carved from an olive branch in the monastery garden. She left at sunrise. No music. No fanfare. No guards. Only one man walked her to the border. Her husband. At Valeria's western border, where a newly founded retirement home had opened, Elena chose to stay as its humble steward, her identity hidden, living like any ordinary woman. Alejandro didn't ask why. He simply kissed her forehead. If one day you forget who you are, know that all of Valeria remembers. A year later, Valeria held a celebration. The decade of love and reform. Elena wasn't there, but her mark was everywhere. In every school, a painting of Elena cradling Matteo in a wheat field. In every clinic, a quote on the wall. Healing is not a privilege. It is a responsibility. In every conference, leaders referenced Elena's path as a model of compassionate governance. Alejandro never remarried. He ruled quietly, rarely making public appearances. Every June, he disappeared from the palace for 3 days. No guards. No carriage. The people knew. He went west to see a woman. Not to bring her back, but to be reminded that true sovereignty is not held in a hand, but carried in a heart. 15 years after Elena left the palace, Valeria entered its golden age. The people were content. Children studied. Elderly farmers received care. Women could govern. And laws based on humanity were honored more than royal decrees. Historians would call this era the age of gentle wisdom, when compassion was not weakness, but a power that reshaped a nation's destiny. And beyond the glow of history, one thing still flowed quietly through time: her letters. Elena, now known as Sister Ameni, lived in a humble nursing home nestled in the western hills. Each morning, she rose early to cook porridge, sweep the floors, teach letters to elderly patients suffering from memory loss, and occasionally tell fairy tales to children from the highlands. No one in the village knew that she had once been queen. But every year, on the birthday of Matteo, the young prince now grown and preparing to ascend the throne, a handwritten letter would arrive at the palace. No name. No seal. Just a line: live in a way that makes life easier for others. When you do that, you are already a king, even without the crown. Alejandro never remarried, though advisors urged him to, for succession's sake. He always refused. My heart was made full by one person. To try and fill it with another would dishonor them both. He grew older, but his eyes remained bright, as if each year he was recharged by those 3 quiet days he spent in the West, in the place that only he and she knew was the source of the light. When Alejandro passed, Matteo was 26. The entire kingdom mourned for 3 days. People poured into the streets, weeping as if saying goodbye to a father. But at the royal funeral, a small figure sat quietly at the end of the last wooden pew, cloaked in a brown robe, head covered by an old cloth. No one recognized her, except Matteo. He stepped down, alone without guards, and approached the woman. He bowed deeply. "Mother, I have lived as you taught me. Now, may I have your blessing, to continue. A week later, at Matteo's coronation, the people of Valeria were stunned. The young king stepped onto the golden dais, without a crown. Instead, he held up a simple old cloak, one that had once belonged to his mother, Elena. His voice trembled as he spoke. "This is the true crown. It holds no gold, no jewels, but it once saved an entire kingdom." The royal hall erupted. Nobles and peasants alike stood, clapping without end. Many wept openly, because they understood. Elena's reign had never ended. It had simply become light. 50 years later, the official history of Valeria recorded. Elena de Montero, a former nun, a woman scorned for leaving the convent, became the only queen in history who ruled without a throne, without a crown, and yet, reigned over the hearts of millions. In everyday speech, the people gave a new name to unexpected kindness. Doing an Elena. When a child shared their lunch with a friend, someone would smile and say, "You just did an Elena." When an old man paused to help a blind girl cross the road, a nearby child would cheer. That's Elena-style kindness. At the old Santa Clara Monastery, where a young girl had once been punished for disobedience, there now stood the Museum of Humanitarian Reform. At its center was a small room, a faithful recreation of the cell where Elena once lived. On the wall, engraved in stone, was her final message, spoken by Matteo after she passed peacefully in her sleep, at age 72. Love does not save the world through miracles. Love saves the world through small, repeated acts, done without growing tired. And that was the legacy Elena left behind. Not just for Valeria, but for all of humanity. Not a crown, not power, not relics, but a path. A path that each of us can walk. All it takes is a single, gentle question. Today, what can I do to make someone's life a little lighter? Leave a comment if you've ever been touched by someone like Elena. And if you believe that love, even the smallest kind, can change a kingdom. Subscribe to our channel. Share this story. Let's keep the light alive. And perhaps one day, when history forgets the names of kings and the dates of wars, someone will still remember a woman in a gray robe, who asked no one to follow her, but simply walked with love, until the world quietly followed. Because true leadership is not carved in stone or sung by trumpets. It is whispered in the way we treat one another, especially when no one is watching. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments. Who is your Elena? Someone who helped you without asking anything in return? Subscribe to Ksitigarbha Tales. If you believe that stories like this can heal, inspire, and change the world, not with noise, but with light, share this video with someone who still believes in quiet kindness. Together, let us walk the path Elena once walked. A path of compassion, of courage, of quiet, everyday love. Because that is how we build kingdoms worth remembering.